Good evening, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. My name is Markus Krah. I'm the Executive Director of the Leo Baeck Institute, New York. And I want to welcome you all to the Leo Baeck Institute here at the Center for Jewish History. I assume that most of you will know that the Leo Baeck Institute has at its core the mission to preserve and promote the history and culture of German-speaking Jews. And I feel that the event tonight is just a perfect fit for what we've been trying to do, and I'm very glad that you all came and that you're interested in this topic. I want to welcome particularly our two speakers tonight, Dr. Michael Levy, right up here, who brought his family, and I see a few friends as well. Welcome and thank you. And Professor Libby Garland, and I'll introduce both speakers properly in a moment. I think the event today is really unique and special because it brings together many of the things which the Leo Baeck Institute has been doing for almost 70 years. We've been founded in 1955. Everything we do is rooted in our collection of archival documents and objects by which we preserve Jewish history and especially family histories. And among these collections is the Levy family collection, about the story of Michael's father, Eric Levy, from Erlangen in southwest Germany, his immigration to the US, and about the family of his mother, Inge Levy, née Thalheimer. And we are very grateful, Michael, that you entrusted us with this precious record of your family, which is an important facet of German Jewish history and one of the many stories which altogether make up German Jewish history. We will hear more about your family history from Michael himself in a bit, and about how his family history has informed his interest and passion for the topic of immigration to the US. And we are very happy and grateful that for that reason he chose to create the Levi-Thalheimer Fund, honoring his parents, which supports research on topics related to immigration and to our efforts to show the relevance of this topic to a broader audience through programs like this one tonight or through exhibits like the one some of you have already seen and everybody will have a chance to see after at the reception following the program tonight. Immigration, as you know, is a complex issue, and I think that's an understatement. So I'm glad that Professor will help us make sense of some of it by sharing her research on the topic and linking it to Michael's family history and to the larger issues of immigration history and policy and politics. It goes without saying, especially 50 days before an important election, that immigration is also a hotly debated, contested issue, which generates a lot of passion, to put it mildly. LBI is traditionally politically neutral and embraces a big tent of positions and identities, but that doesn't mean that we are apolitical or non-political. It is part of our mission to show the relevance of the history we preserve for the current discourse. So what we hope to do is to be a voice from history to inform the present debate about topics like immigration. And I assume and kind of hope that we will touch on this aspect of the topic tonight, and I hope that we can make the passions that we may bring to this fruitful for our discussion. So we will first hear from Professor Libby Garland. She's a professor of history at the CUNY Graduate Center and Kingsborough Community College. She's the author of the prize-winning book, After They Closed the Gates, Jewish Illegal Immigration to the United States, 1921 to 1965, which describes how, after the introduction of restrictive immigration policy in the early 1920s, thousands of Jewish immigrants still risked everything to come to the United States with the help of smugglers, forged documents, and in many complex other ways. Libby will share some of her research on this topic and then engage in a conversation with Michael after he speaks a bit to his family history and what brought him to the topic of immigration and to LBI. Maybe what we will hear will also be connected or reflected in the exhibit, which I invite you to see at the reception following the program, which also looks at the obstacles many Jews had to navigate when they came to the US, particularly those fleeing Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Michael Levy's parents were among those, and he told me that their experience inspired and drove him to create a fund in their name, which we are happy to launch tonight. Michael is the grandson of a cattle dealer in Ellwangen in southwest Germany, and he became the director of the clinical microbiology laboratory at Montefiore Medical Center here in New York until his retirement. So we're looking at, in the span of 2 generations, at a very German, Jewish, American story, and very much in line of what we try to preserve and show the relevance of. Michael will speak about his perspective following Libby's remarks, and maybe speak a little bit about his family history in a conversation which will be moderated by David Brown, LBI's Director of Public History, who with his team is behind this event tonight. Thank you for this. Thank you all for coming. Welcome Michael and your family, and welcome Libby, who will start us off tonight. Thank you.
Hello. Is this good? Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear? Okay, thank you. So thank you, Marcus, and thank you, David, and to Michael, and to everyone at the Leo Baeck for inviting me, including me tonight, and to all of you for coming out. I have about 20 minutes or so of some kind of framing history thoughts, and then I'll be curious where the conversation goes. So I want to start with a story because historians like stories. So I'm going to start with one. And the story is one that is told by, or was told by, Congressman Emanuel Seller, a Brooklyn congressman for many years, who wrote a memoir in 1953. And Seller had been a longtime advocate for immigrants and refugees. And in this story, the story is that he was visited in 1944 by a constituent, and this constituent was a rabbi. And on this visit, the rabbi was extremely upset and was crying. And the rabbi begged Seller to help the millions of Jews who were trapped in Europe. And Seller said he had tried his best. He had advocated with President Roosevelt, he had advocated with the State Department, but to no avail. The rabbi was not appeased by this, and he said, if the lives of millions of cattle, of cows, of cattle were at stake here, the world would be more concerned than they are about European Jews. And these aren't cattle, they're people. They're not cattle, they're people. And the night after this upsetting meeting, Seller writes in his memoir, Congressman Seller had a dream. And in this dream, the rabbi of the visit was standing on a rock in the middle of the ocean, and hordes of people, says Seller, were fighting through the water to get to that rock. And these people in the dream turned to cattle, and then to people, and then back to cattle. And Seller himself, during this dream, was stuck on the shore just watching. So we don't, of course, know whether Congressman Seller really ever had such a dream or whether he really ever met such a rabbi. But what we do know is that by 1953, he had turned this visit and this dream into a literary device, a way to describe, to encapsulate the desperation of people who needed to get out of Europe, and the sort of difficulty of responding to that. But I want to kind of take this dream as a frame for some things to think about tonight, because I think what it also encapsulates with this sort of oscillating image of people to cattle to people to cattle is the precariousness at the heart of an idea that I've been really interested in lately, because I think it matters enormously, which is the idea of the concept of a refugee. And it encapsulates the way that this is a very sort of precarious idea. It's one that isn't fixed. And this is a precariousness that someone like Seller, who is a very astute politician, would have been intensely aware of. So this idea of sort of what refugee has meant in the United States in particular, and how the meaning of that word has been kind of battled over and shifting, is something I want to think about tonight. kind of thinking about, particularly about that time period when Seller and the maybe rabbi met, and then kind of thinking about how those meanings sort of echo out more broadly. So I know that this one issue doesn't sort of cover all the bases that the really excellent exhibition out there does. It certainly doesn't speak to the whole sweep of German Jewish migration, but I wanted to focus on it for a few reasons. One is, as you were saying, Marcus, in the hopes that it might connect a little bit with the moment of your family history of arrival, Michael, and then also because I hope that it serves as a way of kind of putting some of the questions that the exhibition raises into a larger political and historical theme. So I would say that by its very nature, right, the concept of refugee raises some really important questions about migration more broadly. It makes us wrestle with questions about the rights of nations to control human movement, and the rights of human beings to move, and with the tension between those two. And in particular, I want to reflect a little bit in what follows on how Seller's dream story draws our attention to two things. And the first is that question that I think is raised by that oscillation, the people cattle that he describes. And that is a question which is, how do we, I'm sort of putting it in quotes because that's an iffy concept, so international bodies, diplomats, lawmakers, voters, press, families, people migrating themselves, how do we see people who are on the move? When are people who are trying to reach our shores, whether on the US border or on the East Coast of the United States in the 1930s or anywhere else in the world at any other point, when are they perceived as human beings, deserving of asylum and of home? And when, by contrast, are they perceived as kind of animalistic hordes who are invading? So that's one question. The second is something that I think about when I think about this dream story, and I don't focus on Congressman Seller, who's just kind of standing there in his own dream, but on the swimmers in the water themselves. What does it mean to be on the move? To struggle to swim, to struggle to land? How do people navigate these currents that are pushing against them as they try to get from one place to the other? And I also wanted to add that I come to this conversation both as a historian and also as someone who's been involved over the last many years in solidarity work with migrants and refugees. And this is work that I've done in New York, including in immigration courts, in the streets of my own neighborhood, in churches and synagogues. I've also done it on the US-Mexico border. I've done it on the border of Mexico and Guatemala, and and also on the border of Europe and Africa. So in other words, both as a historian and an activist, I really care about thinking about how Jews have participated in this larger history of people in motion who come up against a system of closed border and state control of migration. And I hope that these questions that Seller's story raises can sort of help us think also about the world right now. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is to think a little bit through how this concept of refugee helps us understand the way that US policy and law has kind of seen people on the move. So you only really require special policies to admit refugees or asylum seekers in a world that otherwise has very strict controls on migration. If you don't have strict controls, you don't need sort of special measures to admit some people. So I want to say a few things about such restrictions, which the exhibition also speaks to. So there's never been some golden era of the United States in which everybody was free to move either into the country or within the country. The US has a really long, complicated history of migration control reaching back to its very early years. So, for example, states and localities made policies to keep out the poor. They also made policies to control the mobility of Black people, both enslaved and free. And the nation also, of course, undertook mass expulsions of indigenous peoples. The kind of modern day federal apparatus of control over migration in the United States took root in the late 19th century, particularly around banning the entry of Chinese immigrants. And then many of the elements of the project of that ban were then applied more broadly later on in the early 20th century, really came into their own in the post-World War I era, when laws really rooted in that era's nativism and racism banned immigration from Asia almost entirely, also effectively banned immigration from Africa, severely curtailed migration from Eastern and Southern Europe, and established for the first time such control mechanisms as the US Border Patrol. And in the Depression era, such kind of control over migration got, if anything, more extreme. So rules barring any immigrants at risk of impoverishment were interpreted extra harshly against visa applicants abroad, while at home, hundreds of thousands of Mexicans and Mexican Americans were urged or coerced into being repatriated in the name of kind of economic national need. So in that era of Sellers' dream and of your family's arrival, the US was a nation deeply invested in restricting, in sorting, in excluding, in detaining, in deporting immigrants. And what I want to emphasize here is that with a few important exceptions at that time, the US immigration law had no official exemptions for or recognition of refugees as a separate class of people who might have some kind of special claim on entering through an otherwise pretty tightly closed gate. And this kind of recognition really only happened sweepingly after World War II, at a moment when the United States was developing its new vision of itself as an international leader and a humanitarian defender of democracy. And along with this went a kind of new commitment to accepting some foreign victims of persecution and to defining the idea of a refugee as fundamentally different from other immigrants. So as the exhibition reminds us, for example, a big moment in this was in 1948 when the United States Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act, which it then amended in 1950, which is pretty much the first large-scale law aimed at admitting refugees. And around the same time, the international community, in the face of mass displacement, was kind of coalescing around some new commitments to refugees. So it wasn't the start of an international discussion around refugee policy, but it helped sort of put into place some of the framework that for the United States is still very important, particularly this 1951 UN treaty that defines what a refugee is, somebody who is escaping from certain very specific kinds of persecution and who you are not supposed to send back to where they came from if they would be in danger. The US actually didn't sign on to that until 1968, but then it did, and in the 1970s, the United States began to formalize the process by which people who met this definition of a refugee could request asylum from the US once they arrived here. And then in 1980, the US Congress passed a law, a Refugee Act, stating a commitment to a certain level of refugee admissions and also codifying the idea that people who met the definition of a refugee, if here, could also apply for asylum. They weren't guaranteed to be granted it, but they were able to request it. So the US technically has codified some commitment to giving kind of special consideration to some people that it deems to have a particular claim on entering the nation because of particular sorts of persecution, understood to be refugees. But this commitment was always super ambivalent. So there was always sort of a humanitarian goals side to that commitment, but also that commitment was always qualified, limited, and grudging. So that the sort of idea of refugees also has always kind of pointed both toward opening and toward closing at the same time, toward humanitarian welcome and toward suspicion. And distance. So in Sellers' era, for example, many lawmakers and much of the American public remained super anti any immigration from anybody, refugee or no. And even after 1945, there was kind of deep suspicion of refugees that remained in this country. The perception of refugees as unwanted invaders who might bring dangerous political ideas or who had criminal tendencies had deep, long roots in the American political tradition of anti-immigrant attitudes. And folks who were advocating for the refugees of this era, for example, somebody like Seller, worked really hard to kind of change this story and had some success, I think, but also were never entirely successful. I also just kind of want to note that who has been deemed worthy of being considered a refugee or someone who deserves some kind of admission outside of the kind of closed, outside through these kind of otherwise closed gates of, exclusion. Should I do something about that? Should we leave that? Okay. I'm sorry, technology. Okay. So who has sort of gotten to get let in through this otherwise locked door has always been a real political question. And for many years after World War II, for example, the US gave great preference to people who it deemed to be escaping from communism. That was a real sort of Cold War priority for the United States, but not so much consideration to other people. So in the 1980s, for example, even after the passage of that refugee law, those who were fleeing US-stoked upheavals in Central America, in Haiti, were often really categorically denied recognition as refugees, as people with a claim to asylum and to haven and to welcome. And globally, too, the sort of who has counted as refugees in different ways has been highly political. So that 1951 UN convention was very much focused on Europe. And as many people at the time and since have noted, others were really treated differently or left out. So people in India or China or Palestinians all were sort of outside of that framework. Okay, so that's just some sort of super quick background on how the United States has done this kind of sorting and excluding, and the ways that this sort of idea of a refugee, I think, helps us see some of the larger real tensions between in this immigration system and sort of how people encounter it, this tension between kind of exclusion and entrance that is characteristic of nations in the modern world in general and of the United States. So I want to turn now briefly to that second issue that I said that I think that Sellers' dream story raises for us. And this is one that I think about often both as a historian and also as an activist in this world right now of sort of solidarity work with people on the move. And this is the issue of how much people often have to struggle, have to work to get from one place to another, to kind of in the language of Sellers' dream, have to fight their way through the waters to reach safe haven, to reach firm ground. So sometimes historians or sociologists or journalists talk about migration flows, like people flowing, and that always makes me really sad because people do not flow. For people to move, it's in fact, they have to work at that moving. It takes an enormous amount of labor and often ingenuity. It takes support networks of friends and families and other kinds of advocates, and that's really important, I think, to remember. Political and kind of journalistic discourse also often kind of talks about immigrants or people on the move as though their legal status was a fixed part of their identity. So somebody is a refugee or a visa holder or a permanent resident, But in fact, people's status relative to immigration policy and immigration law is often something that is a matter of argument and interpretation, and something that people have to fight for. So recognition to be in a status that gets you where you need to go is something that takes work. And so one way that we could kind of think about that, like shape-shifting in Congressman Seller's dream, the people going to becoming cattle, becoming people, is partly about that sort of mighty effort that people on the move in general, refugees now and then in particular, had to do to assert their status as human and thus as deserving of asylum. And so I just want to give one example that I think the exhibition also speaks to really nicely of this kind of mighty effort from the moment right after World War II. And this is the sort of enormous amount of labor, of work that European Jews who survived the war and wanted to come to the United States, many of them who were in displaced persons camps after the war, for example, the kind of labor that they had to undertake to do that, even in the face of US law that sort of officially said, like, okay, there is a door that's now open. But even in the face of that law, people still had to really push to make a claim that they were eligible to kind of pass through that door. They had to stake a claim to that. And in fact, the law it wasn't only that the law didn't open the door, widely. It was also that law, which was sort of really the first law that said the U.S. was going to admit refugees, also made it a real struggle for people to claim that status under the law. And when you go to the archives for this era, and I'm sure there's also much in the Leo Baeck archives that speaks to this, or when you look at your own family history often, or when you look at the exhibition, you start to realize what an absolute sort of sea of paperwork refugees and their advocates had to navigate in that era. So in that moment, right, post-war, all that paperwork had to be assembled and processed and then okayed by different government agencies for those people who wanted to come to the United States. So you had to, if you wanted to come to the United States, you had to get assurances from various aid organizations pledging to provide employment and housing. And then this bundle had to go to authorities in Washington, and then from there, they were sent to various authorities abroad. And you had to have photos, you had to have birth certificates, you had to have marriage certificates, police reports, proof of residence in the Allied occupied zones, all of these documents that you had to somehow gather in this very chaotic post-war situation. You had to undergo a security check by the military, by the US military, and you had more than one medical exam that you had to pass. And one leader in a US aid organization described this incredibly sort of complicated documentary gauntlet as being a maze that few people have found their way through. This bureaucratic process was maddening for refugees who had to deal with it on top of everything else that they had to deal with, the daily survival. It was maddening for their family. It was maddening for advocates who tried to help them. But each of those pieces of paper were represented work that people did and had to do if they were going to be able to not flow, but move to where they needed to get to. And I think about this kind of sort of sea of paperwork often. On Friday, this coming Friday, I'm gonna go sit in Midtown in the basement of a very nice synagogue there and work with some people who have themselves who are immigrants, who have carried many pieces of paper across many, many miles and have navigated the incredibly difficult process of asylum applications, and now on Friday will be filling out yet another set of paperwork that they need to do in order to get a work permit so that they can work for a living. So this kind of documentary maze that the United States has put in place as part of its migration control that people have to navigate is still very much in place. And people still very much have to sort of fill out form by form by form they have to find their way through this maze or sort of find their way through this sea of paperwork. Okay, so those are the two kind of things I wanted us to think about, and I'm going to wrap up and turn it over to Michael. And I just wanted to sort of conclude by saying that, like Marcus, you asked me to put the German Jewish immigrant experience in a larger historical context, which I haven't quite done, but maybe done from a few angles. But I hope at least that this kind of dream of sellers, if we sort of use it as a way to kind of think about both the past and the present, help us really grapple a little bit with the questions of inclusion, exclusion, and sort of struggling through the barriers of that people have to do in order to get where it is that they need to go. So thank you very much. And Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sit down and have a chat? Is that how you want to do it, or?
Let's start by speaking from the podium.
Oh, I don't want to speak for that.
Okay. Well, let's sit down.
All right, would you like to be in the middle? You're the center.
I'm very bad with microphones. My son will tell you, last time we were in Germany, I kept screwing up with the microphone. So. Should I start? You want to start?
No, you start.
Okay, well, Michael Levy, I'm welcome. First of all, I really want to thank Marcus for being helping me organize this thing, and Leo Beck for doing something which I learned is very important through my own family history, which is documenting their stories. I really wasn't, is this thing even on? I really wasn't really prepared to make a lecture or a speech. Stop laughing, Doug. But I just think I was a dumb kid. I mean, I was a dumb kid. I grew up in Long Island, and I was very Americanized, and I was more worried about Little League. My Little League partner is here tonight. Girls and music, and I really didn't pay much attention to what my family was really, their history was. But now that I'm just listening here tonight, I thought of two things. One is I read my father's Army scrapbook, and it told the story about who he was, that he came from this town in Ellwangen, in Baden-Württemberg, a small town, and that his father was a cattle dealer, and they drowned the cattle, and they were lucky to get out. And somehow, my whole life, and maybe I was a kid, I was 12, 13, whatever, I always felt like that was part of my history, and I had to do something about that. I had to do something about that, but I wasn't sure what to do. And then the other thing, which was, I used to go to my grandmother's house, and her name was Grunstein, and I thought of her as Paula Grunstein, and my grandfather being Fritz Grunstein, and he always had a big map of Germany in his workshop. But their towels in their powder room had T's on them. And as I said, I was a dumb kid. Why do they have T's on the towel? And it turned out there was another story there, which was that my true grandfather had died in Germany from an illness before Hitler, and my mother remarried it. But I never understood what that was about. And amazingly tonight, one of my coworkers from many, many years ago at Montefiore shows up here. And I was sitting at Montefiore at my desk in 2002, and I get a call from Ellwangen saying I have to be there in 5 days because they have an exhibit in this town, and the name of the exhibit is Wer war Eric Levy, which is Who was Eric Levy? And it seemed like a dream that this was happening. Anyway, it happened, and from there, from 2002 to right now, I started to understand the significance of their lives and understand some of the troubles of their lives, because they were lucky in that they got here and they had sponsors here, so they didn't have all the trauma of being true refugees. And well, they were refugees, but they didn't have they got it. And I don't know exactly how, and my father joined the army, so that was, but I started to understand the importance of that. And in thinking about tonight, I want to get back to it, I thanking all my friends who are here. Very meaningful for me that you've come tonight. And what's amazing to me, and my partner Vicky, is that we represent so much here. We represent Vicky's father was an Armenian refugee, the German refugees, the Austrian refugees, the East European refugees. We have I have an Irish friend who's here, Irish refugees, Italian refugees. And it just continues. The stories continue. As I was telling, I think Marcus before, there's so many connections that we never thought could happen between us, my friends, that happened over the years about people who had connections with people that I knew were connected to them. So it's a continuing story, and it's been quite meaningful, I think, to all of us. Just as a sample, my friend Doug, who's sitting back there, turns out that my old mentor, who was named Leo Kass, who had escaped Warsaw and the Anschluss, and became the head of pathology at Montefiore. One day I was talking to him about my German experience, and he said, oh, well, when I got off the boat, Dr. Sepkowitz helped me. And I said, what are you talking about? My friend Doug Sepkowitz, we go skiing together. How could he have been there to help you? It turned out it was his father, and it turned out to be this amazing connection. And my friend Elliot, who's sitting there, I don't want to forget anybody. It turns out that last year we were Stoppelsteiner in Ellwangen for the Levy family. There were quite a few of them for having been forced out of Germany. And then Elliot and I met in Rotterdam with his wife and Vicky, and we saw the home where his maternal grandparents were taken away. And we looked down and we said, we're the Stoppelsteiner, and next month he's going to have them placed in Rotterdam. And I think it's been quite meaningful to us all. And personally, my children, I think they've been connected in a way that wouldn't have happened had not that call come in 2002 to their family history. And ultimately, amazing connections, the Armenian story that Raphael Lemkin, when he read of the Armenian story, it led him to understand what the significance of what happened in the 30s and 40s in Europe, and he coined the term Holocaust. And it's just been a very meaningful thing. Let me look at my notes. I don't want to forget anything. I think that's about all I want. I think ultimately, I'm so happy there are Dr. Garland's and Leo Beck, because I think these stories are important. They're important to our country now because of this craziness that we're living through with so much fear about people who are trying to make a good life for themselves. And in fact, it's interesting that my old employees in Martha, because I was thinking about it, I worked for 27 years in the Bronx, and everybody had come from somewhere else, either forced to come from somewhere else or came here and made a good life for themselves. And it was a common bond, I think, between many of us there. So, and I'm thankful so much for the Leo Beck that you're here, and hopefully that that all this will have a positive effect on the world. And that was my goal. And it gave me an opportunity to try to do something to make a positive effect on the world. So that's really what I wanted to say. So I'll stop and let you guys go.
Yeah, well, on behalf of Leo Beck Institute, you said that you recalled reading your father's war scrapbook and getting a sense of a history, and you felt like you needed to do something with it. And so we're just very grateful that the thing that you one of the things you decided to do with it was bring us together here tonight and support the Leo Baeck Institute, and also give us the chance to hear Libby Garland's really thought-provoking and moving and kind of poetic with that dream remarks. So thank you both. Michael, maybe I'll start by asking a couple of questions for each of you, and then we can open it up to the audience. We heard a lot from Libby about the sort of enormous labor involved in just, particularly for the situation of German Jews in the 1930s, of getting out, paying confiscatory taxes, getting a quota number, getting all kinds of health checkups and a Führungszeugnis and everything else that you needed to emigrate, and then, being subject to the whims of various bureaucrats. But one thing I'm interested to hear from you, Michael, is, there's also kind of an emotional story to all that, and a lot of extremely painful decisions about leaving your home, leaving other members of your family, your community. In the case of German-speaking Jews, also just the apparent imminent loss of that community or a possibility of its continuation. And I wonder if you could reflect on what sense you got of how difficult those decisions were for your father, or I guess he was relatively young, 18 years old, right? So your grandparents, if they shared any of that with you, if they didn't, and what sense you got of that sort of emotional labor and pain involved?
Well, I think that I'll start by saying I was a dumb kid, so I didn't realize what was going on. But I remember, you have to know Ellwangen. It's called Ellwangen on the Jagst, which is a little river that runs through this town. But I remember as a kid going with my father to 145th Street, where his father lived, Julius Levy. He came to New York. They were 145th Street on Riverside Drive by a river which is not so small, the Hudson River, and he didn't know what to do. What was he going to do? He was a cattle dealer, and I think it was painful for my father to see his father lost, and it was also painful because his mother, my grandmother, who I never met, she worked as a chambermaid and died young of a heart attack. I'm sure they all smoked too much, but that's pretty typical. So there was a change of life that they couldn't. I mean, they were able to obviously live their life and stuff, but it was something that it was so different than living in this 30,000 farming community of Baden-Württemberg, and they were kind of lost. And I think for my father, it was somewhat of a pain. There was humiliation and pain involved since he was never educated. He went in the army. He did, that's a whole other story we don't have to get into now, but had no education, just had to go to work. I know that he just went to work as an export-import and was always working and trying to make things, and he did well, but it was painful, and he never felt that he was adequate and I think it had to do with what happened in Germany, especially being thrown out of school at 13. So
yeah, and in terms of really difficult decisions, I think I have the story right. Your father had a younger brother, Max. Is it?
Max was sent to Kindertransport.
Right, and so that's another. I mean, that's an incredible decision to send your child off unaccompanied.
And they never, as I said, they didn't talk about this stuff. That's why going to Germany, connecting with people who told us, I used to play. My father used to play cards with your grandfather in this cafe, and you realize they were. I remember one year, Ellwangen is a small town, has two streets that are kind of perpendicular, and The woman had an apartment right at the corner. She was one of the Brewers family, they have brewery. And she was very upset because when the Americans came, they took her apartment because the army officer wanted to be able to see up and down the streets, which had been changed to Adolf Hitler's Straße and something else. And now they were back to some other name. But I kind of lost my train of thought here.
Sending Max on the kinder
Oh,
transport.
but my grandfather, she told us, he would go to lunch and he, under his plate, he'd find a note, get out of town, get out of here, get out. And I guess he was smarter. He said, let's go. And in 1938, they left. And I don't know the details of their leaving, but at least I know they left. And there was a little article in the local newspaper which had a typical, like, oh, look, they're crying for these people. Who would cry for these people? Something to that effect. So it was tough. It was tough. And as the story, my father was driven and died young in a car accident. And he smoked too much. He drove too fast. He drank too much. It's not atypical for a German.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Libby, maybe along the same lines, either from your historical research or even from your more recent activism and solidarity work, do you have any reflections to share about the sort of emotional toll of the decisions that migrants are making to, uproot themselves?
It's such an interesting question, and actually, I have two thoughts. One is about archival work, and well, they're both about archival work, really.
That's great. Perfect.
I thought it might fit in. One is, I think that, we were talking about this earlier too. I think that this question of silences in families around really the deepest and most painful things is common, right? I think that's something that is true in many, many families. And so one kind of historical research, it's certainly not the only kind, but it's sort of one genre of historical research, I think is in part inspired by silences in families where people, and this is partly true for me, right? Like, it took me a really long time to understand this, but that part of my interest in the time period that I was researching for that book that you described had to do with family histories that were sort of shadowy presences in my own life that I sort of realized I was like hunting through, cardboard boxes in Washington, D.C. and New York archives to try to find more about, although they were so shadowy in my own family that it took me like a very long time to understand that. And it also makes me think of something from my teaching today, actually, that came up, which was my students were reading a really beautiful little article by a historian named Judy Young, who was a historian of Chinese immigration and was particularly interested in women and particularly interested in the stories that women told in sort of oral histories. And she writes this article about how she met this woman who came in 1939, when Chinese exclusion was still in effect, so sort of right around the same time that your parents came, that your dad came, and this woman was detained for almost 2 years on Angel Island in San Francisco, and then deported, and then she came back, as a kind of a fake war bride. So she came back under false pretenses, and in 1955, a neighbor turned her in, and she had to undergo this kind of grilling by US authorities. But what a lot of my students were noticing was that this grilling, this sort of interview with the authorities, where she then shared all these really traumatic details about how she was essentially trafficked from one man to another, was not something that she had told the historian writing the piece, Judy Young, in earlier interviews, and was something that she had also never shared with her own children. So her children only found the story later by going to the National Archives and sort of finding this file in the National Archives. So that's not so much a story about her own decision-making, although ultimately she decided to marry somebody else and kind of get out of the situation. But it is this story about how sort of some of the really most painful aspects of migration are kind of present in family lives, but not always entirely present, and sometimes actually sort of revealed by archival research in complicated ways. So I guess that's sort of a
No, it's, yeah.
response from a slightly different angle to what you were asking.
Well, it's always a good angle if it heads towards the archives at Leo Baeck Institute. Michael, at one point you were talking about your parents' family, and you said sort of not real refugees or refugees. I thought that was kind of an interesting slip up, and I wonder how your father and your parents, your father and your grandparents, I should both your parents and grandparents, I'm sorry, integrated that experience of being a refugee into their story, and how that sort of flowed down. I mean, there's and not just, I mean, there's refugee, but then there's also German, Jewish, and or German-Jewish, you know, and American are all sort of stories and identities that you could hold on to, and maybe different generations do it differently. How did that work in your family?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I think it was kind of a non-clinical form of schizophrenia. My father and mother would have two sets of friends. There would be the American friends, all professionals who went to college and had law degrees or medical degrees, et cetera. And they basically, I think that was what my father wanted to do also, but he never could. So, but he always felt inferior. There were a lot of moments in my years where these came up as critical points, like you had to do. Why did he ask me to do that? Because he couldn't do it, because he was intimidated by the fact that he had never achieved those kind of things. And then there were the German crowd, which my father lived at Shalom, you know, on Second Avenue. He would bring home, you know, we weren't kosher, we were German Jews, we were Yekes, as they called me, Maimonides, my first hospital. And he would bring home pork chops and Landjäger and all the stuff that my kids like to eat. And so there was like this attachment to Germany, attachment to who they were, and yet this desire to be somebody else. So, and I think that's why we were in the middle, like, just be American kids, just be American kids. And it's funny because, as I said, only my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, tried to teach me German as a kid. Nobody else cared about teaching me any German. That was out the window. And I've paid, and I'm struggling now every week trying to learn a little more German. But
one interesting thing, if you look at the collection of photographs and postcards that your father sent during his war service to his parents, your grandparents, I mean, he seems to really be embracing an American identity. I mean, in the context of being in the US military, having just beat the Germans, that makes a lot of sense, but it's also interesting, you know, he's writing in English, kind of.
But I just prepared a document for something else, and I find this a little bit mystical, which is that my parents went to Venice in like 1955 or something. They left us with my maternal grandparents. And my mother wrote a card to my sister in English. My father wrote me a card in German. And when I was thinking about that, I said, wow, you know, I know it seems trivial, but when I was really thinking, why did he write to me in German? And I felt that it was I don't want to say a message from the grave, but I felt that it was him telling me something about who he was. And I just recently used those two little postcards in a document, and I found it very meaningful. As I found as I said, all is very meaningful and hopeful that we can tell these stories and help other people understand the importance of immigrants, refugees, whatever the exact title is for those people, that they enrich our life. They've enriched my life, they've enriched my kids' life, they've enriched my friends' lives, and that's really the answer.
Great. I think we have a little time for discussion, questions from the audience. If anyone, yeah, here, I'll hand the microphone around so that we also get the audio. Well, for the recording.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Just a little minor point is my parents came here in the 30s, and their friends that came after the war, who were in camps, who were survivors, they referred to them as the refugees. My parents never referred to themselves as refugees. So that's just, they maybe would have called themselves immigrants, but not refugees. So they made that distinction, for whatever that means. Is that significant to you, or?
I mean, it would be a really interesting question for them, right? Like what it meant to them. I think, I mean, I would say two things to that. One is that, you know, refugee is sort of both like a legalistic term, and then it's also just like a word that we use in the language. And in sort of the US legal context, for example, it wasn't a status that somebody, almost entirely for the most part, it wasn't a status that somebody was going to have in the 1930s. But if I had to guess without knowing them, maybe sort of what was in operation there, I mean, I think the idea of refugee has always been a word that sort of cuts in two directions. And one direction is that it makes a claim on a nation and says, we have a really good reason for you to let us in because of this persecution, suffering, fleeing. But there's another sort of meaning to it that kind of gets attached to the word, which is of abjection, of suffering, of loss. And I think for many people, for really powerful and good reasons, and this sort of goes back to the emotional part of history, I think it's not necessarily a way that people want to think about themselves. There's this essay by Hannah Arendt called We Refugees, I think from 1943. Someone in this room probably knows. 44, okay. Where she kind of talks about this, sort of what it feels like to be called a refugee and sort of why it's complicated. That kind of picks up on that.
I have a question about immigration from Europe after 1933 and before World War II started. And in my family, there are all sorts of stories that I have no idea whether they're true. Some I know are not true, but some may or may not be true. There were a number of stories about circumventing the whole process involving things like paper bags being taken to a consulate that had a lot of cash in them. And I'd like to know, to what extent were people getting out of Germany and Austria, say in the 30s, after 1933, doing stuff that was illegal in violation of US law in order to get in either to the US or to Canada or another country?
That's a great question. In my own sort of archival searches, I was really focused more on the sort of an earlier period, sort of the 1920s in a lot of my research. But to the extent that I was also interested in the time period that you're talking about in the 1930s, yeah, I mean, I think the sort of the basic truth is that people who have to go somewhere do what they need to do, or they make a decision. If their decision is that they need to go somewhere, then they do their best to figure out how to do that. And that for people who are facing difficulties, for example, if coming to the United States was what somebody needed to do, then there were, sort of various things that they might do, such as try to procure a visitor visa and then overstay that visa. And this is something that people who need to come here still sometimes do, right? So yeah, I mean, I haven't personally encountered a story about a bag of cash, but yes, like people were taking bribes. I mean, officials with power could capitalize on that power for sure. So that surprises me not at all. But I still think that it's both true at the same time that people are and were creative and used a lot of ingenuity to try to figure out how to get somewhere, and that it was exceedingly difficult and a lot of people were not able to do that. And that has been, I think, true, thinking about it from the US perspective, of every restriction on mobility and travel. If you make it really hard for people, it is in fact hard. It's harder for people to get somewhere. Does that make sense? So, I mean, I don't think that every single person who wanted a visa was able to bring a bag of cash and then get it, which is of course not what you're saying. But yes, no, I mean, I think those stories, without kind of knowing a whole bunch of specific ones at the top of my head, I think those stories are all very plausible.
I'd like to know about the quotas. Was it a certain number that was strictly enforced? Because I know stories of people, Eastern European Jews, who try to come to New York or try to come to the United States and were lucky enough to get on a boat thinking that they were coming to the United States. But they wound up in Cuba, they wound up in South America, Central America, Mexico. How strictly enforced were these quotas? I mean, everyone knows about the boat that tried to land in Palestine, and the British refused to allow them to come in, and they had to turn back, and many of them were killed in the Holocaust.
So in 1924, the US Congress passed a law that was that the exhibition speaks to, that it was a harsher version of an earlier law in 1921, which then in turn were building on decades of practice of restricting immigration through Chinese exclusion and through Asian exclusion. And that 1924, those quotas that you were talking about, was this kind of crazy formula that the United States Congress came up with, which was nominally about sort of preserving the ethnic and racial makeup of the country, but really was about basically cutting off, making sure that banning Asian migration and limiting migration from places seen as less desirable sources of migration, such as Southern and Eastern Europe and Central Europe. So there were these sort of nation by nation quotas or numerical limits in place for much of the world during that time period. And the question was about enforcement, like how good was it? And that's a complicated question that's like dear to my researcher's heart. I think the answer was both that it definitely was enforced in that it made it really hard for people who, from places that had very small quotas or zero quota, to come to the United States. So for example, people from Southern and Eastern Europe, it wasn't only that the number was small, it was also that the process was different, and people had to get a whole bunch of documents together and get a visa at a consulate before they could get to the United States at all, or embark for the United States at all. And that was really arduous. It's also true, as you say, that especially at the beginning of that system, when it was new and sort of nobody knew how it was working or how it was going to be enforced, there were shipping companies that apparently were telling people that if they could but get to Cuba or to Mexico, that it was just a hop, skip, and a jump to the United States, if that was their ultimate destination, or to Canada, and then a hop, skip, and a jump to the United States. And so that was something that happened to people. So I think it was in my research, I think what I found was that the US government made a mighty effort to enforce these things with the resources that it had, both sort of bureaucratic and physical, like on the borders of the United States. And many people also found ways around them. And I think many people also sort of ended up being detoured to other places as well. Sometimes where they stayed, and sometimes places from which they've been left. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and we'll go to the back, but we'd love to continue the conversation with some refreshments afterwards, but we'll take one more.
Just 2 points. My family is from Poland, and almost all of my parents' extended family was murdered. And what a loss to the United States and the world, that their descendants could have contributed so much and never got the opportunity. Secondly, I wanted to ask you, I was talking to my Israeli brother-in-law, and I made some sort of political statement which he thought would not be good for Israel. And he said, well, what do you expect from American Jews? They didn't pressure Roosevelt during World War II to bomb the tracks and save, people that could have been saved. Do you know anything? Was there more that we could have done then? Anybody? Does anyone know about that?
I mean, would someone else like to speak to that? I mean, my very short answer, which is a little bit of a non-answer, would be that this very question has been a matter of much debate among a bunch of historians who have really sort of worked at figuring out exactly what happened. So there's lots of books in that regard, and there's still disagreement. I mean, I think, I'm gonna leave it there. I mean, so I can see why he said that, although it's a little bit of it seemed something of a provocation in your direction.
All right, well, now that we've gotten deep into the historical debates, maybe we could just leave it at thank you, Michael, thank you, Libby. And the debate and discussion can continue. But thank you all very much for joining us.